And that will include some of these things here. So More in Common's latest MRP, some of the campaign trackers we've been following over the last week, some policy announcements. We had a big policy blitz from the Conservatives recently. And then some of what might change over the campaign, the threat of Reform UK to the Conservatives' prospects of a recovery, and some of the focus group insights from the debates this week. So firstly, More in Common's MRP, we surveyed 15,000 people, and we used this to try and work out how the national voting intention translates down to a constituency level, trying to estimate which seats will be won by Labour or the Conservatives. It's a kind of standard technique that pollsters use to try and predict the elections. And that's based on a number of things. So firstly, demographics. So how are people with a degree voting? How are people who are young or old voting? And we take all this information about different people and how their voting patterns are changing over the campaign, and then predict that at a constituency level. And this gives you the map on the right here. So on our model, we have Labour winning 382 constituencies, which would give them a majority of 114, historically very high majority, but not quite as high as Tony Blair achieved in 1997, but still the party's best result since 2001. This leaves the Conservatives with a very, very steep path to recovery. You can see here just how the composition of Parliament would change between 2019 on the left and our current predictions on the right. And much like the famous Portillo moment in 97, there are a couple of cabinet ministers who could potentially lose their seats under our current projections. That includes some of the names here: Alex Talk, Penny Mordaunt, and Grant Shapps and David Davies. Because of how MRPs work, we get a range of estimates. So this isn't it isn't a single number, but it's the most likely number. So we actually find that there is a scenario in which the Conservatives could win 187 seats, but their worst scenario gives them 168. So quite a margin there for the Conservatives. Now, there are a lot of marginal seats here. So the margin for victory is very, very thin. There are about 43 seats in our model where the Conservatives are projected to lose by less than 4 points. So any tightening could see Labour's majority reduce quite a lot. But by the same token, there are about the same number of seats, 49 or so, where the Conservatives are just hanging on by 4 points. So it wouldn't take much movement in the polls for the Conservatives to come near sort of total wipeout territory from their 180 down to 130, which would be their worst result, well, certainly in post-war politics. And then I think one of the key things to note is just how marginal a lot of seats are in Scotland. And that's been the case for the last two elections with the rise of the SNP in 2015. There are a lot of three-way marginals in Scotland where it could go either way between SNP, Lib Dems and the Conservatives, or SNP, Labour and the Conservative Party. So many of these seats are really too close to call right now. If Labour won all of the seats where they're currently within 4% of the SNP, they could win 28. So really, we could be talking about anywhere between a story where the SNP recover or hold on by the skin of their teeth in Scotland, or a different scenario where they're looking like near total wipeout in Scotland. It's very, 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 very thin. So how's the campaign been going so far? Well, we are roughly where we were at the beginning. There hasn't been a lot of tightening in the polls, which is defying historical expectations. Potentially slight increase in Labour's lead, but only by 1 or 2 points. It's very hard to tell right now. The main story is that nothing much is happening. over the campaign. Although there is, under the surface, a little bit of a shift in what Britons think is most important, the most important issue that they think is facing the country. So we've seen a slight decrease in the cost of living as the top issue, although it still dominates by a large margin, and a slight increase in the share of people who think that the NHS is the top issue, but also who think that immigration is the top issue. Immigration is now at its highest for a long time, according to our trackers. One of the stories that I think is coming through in the campaign is whether there's any difference really between the Conservative Party and the Labour Party. Now, it shouldn't come as a massive surprise that Conservative voters think there's a big difference and Labour voters think there's a big difference. But if you look at those smaller parties, especially Reform UK, we find that almost half of people think there's not really any difference between the Conservatives and Labour. And we hear that when we talk to voters across the country in focus groups, this general sense of apathy that there's really not much choice. The parties are much the same, the leaders are much the same. And so there's this kind of anti-politics mood that I think you can really see quite clearly from this graph here. Now, it's also true of the Liberal Democrats and the Greens, but not quite as much as among Reform UK voters. How are the leaders doing? Well, we've seen Rishi Sunak increase his approval very slightly over the campaign, but that's still -30. Is very bad indeed. And actually, Keir Starmer over the campaign has seen his net approval just about tick into the positive. So doing slightly better as the campaign progresses. What do voters think of the main leaders? Well, a bit similar to how we saw earlier with the two parties being seen as much the same. Voters think that Starmer and Sunak actually share some traits. They both come across as intelligent to the electorate. They also both come across as weak. You look at the two graphs here, weak comes near the top in the sort of top 5 or so traits for both leaders. But the distinction here is where Keir Starmer is seen as professional, Rishi Sunak is not, and where Starmer is also seen as indecisive. So there's a bit of a mix there. And Sunak comes across as incompetent, and that partly reflects voters' views of the last 14 or so years of Conservative government. So who would voters like to see as PM? Starmer has a slight lead here, but it's still less than half of people would like to see Keir Starmer enter number 10. And there's very clear partisan differences here. Conservative voters prefer Sunak, Labour voters prefer Keir Starmer. But I think one thing to take away is, if you look at the Liberal Democrats here, almost half of them would like to see Keir Starmer as Prime Minister. Only 10% would like to see Rishi Sunak remain as PM. Now I think that would bode well for the Labour campaign if they're hoping to pick up some votes from Liberal Democrats to kind of squeeze the vote of smaller centre-left parties. That bodes very well for them. On the other hand, that doesn't seem to be as true for Reform UK. Only 32% would actually like Rishi Sunak to be Prime Minister. Now, there's no enthusiasm for Keir Starmer either, and by far and away, the most common answer among Reform UK voters is don't know to that question, which reflects what we saw earlier with them thinking there's not a lot of difference between the two main parties. And among non-voters and those who are undecided, neither candidate comes across particularly well. There's really no enthusiasm for Starmer or Sunak. What do the leaders stand for? So this, I think, doesn't bode too well for Keir Starmer. We talk to voters in focus groups across the country all the time, every day. And one of the things that comes across very clearly is that voters really aren't sure what Labour stands for. They're not sure what Keir Starmer stands for either. And that is reflected very clearly here. There's, of course, some partisan differences, but yeah, undecided voters are slightly clearer on what Sunak stands for than Keir Starmer. And I think we saw some of that in the reactions to the debate, but I'll save that for a bit later. So another big story recently was about Diane Abbott standing as Labour MP or not. And for many voters, that hasn't changed their perception of Keir Starmer, but where it has cut through, it seems to have come across slightly negatively than positively. So about twice as many people view him more negatively now than positively. And undecided voters are also more likely to view Keir Starmer negatively as a result of this story. So how have recent policy announcements gone down? We had a policy blitz from the Conservatives recently. What do voters think of that? Well, on the first issue, on cracking down on Mickey Mouse degrees at universities, comes across fairly well as a policy. It polls quite well. So the public are about 3 times as likely to say the Conservative proposal is a good idea than a bad idea. And even those who are voting Labour or undecided think it's a good idea by quite large margins. Second one we'll deal with here is the quadruple lock or the triple lock plus. This is a policy that is fairly popular across all age groups, although we only see a majority in favour once voters tend to hit retirement age or near retirement age. You can see in that 55 to 64 category, a majority are in favour, but it doesn't quite command majority support amongst voters younger than that. But still, by large margins, even younger voters think that this is a good idea. There's really no electoral gain to watering down pensions commitments. Younger voters want to see their grandparents taken care of. Onto Labour now. GB Energy polls quite well, very well, in fact. The difference here is voters tend to be quite apathetic about the government's ability to deliver on its promises. So although it's a popular policy, only a third of people think that GB Energy will reduce their energy bills, and almost half think that it will increase the amount of tax they pay. So we see here that it's quite a popular policy. People think it's a good idea. But again, there's this sense that politicians throw out all these wonderful promises, but when it actually comes to government, they don't deliver. And we're speaking to voters in Wiltshire, I picked out a quote here that I think is particularly emblematic of that attitude. In theory, it sounds like a good idea and would, bring benefits, taking control of a key industry away from greedy corporations. But when it comes down to it, is this actually gonna is it gonna happen? Are politicians going to actually follow through on their promises? And will it really deliver all the benefits they say it's going to? There's a lot of skepticism here from the public. So with a few weeks left of the campaign, what could change? As we saw at the beginning, the polls haven't narrowed. There's not been a lot of tightening, which historically we might have expected to see so far. If you think about the last 2 times where the government changed, 1997, Labour's lead fell by 10 points in the run-up to polling day, and then in a similar vein in 2010, when the Conservatives came back into government after a spell in opposition, the Conservatives' lead fell by 4 points in the last few months of the parliament. But this has not happened this time. Polls have been very, very stable so far. But a good or a bad campaign can make all the difference. And 2017 is a really good example of that. We see that in 2017, Theresa May started out with a huge lead, 18 points. It's not quite as much as Keir Starmer has right now, but still, stonking great lead over Jeremy Corbyn during that election, but only finished about 2 points ahead on polling day. So this graph here imagines what could happen if the same sort of thing happens again, where Starmer's lead shrinks. It would shrink to about 6 points if the same pattern happened, but in reverse, where the Tory party catches up to Labour over the last few weeks. But even still, Starmer would remain 6 points ahead on polling day because he's starting so far ahead right now. And if you map that onto constituencies, you can see it makes quite a big difference. It changes about 60 odd seats could come back to the Conservatives in England if that tightening happened. Manifestos, we're expecting manifestos soon. Do they have any effect? Generally, no. What we've done here is mapped or graphed rather the polls in a few weeks before the manifestos and a few weeks after, and we see that in most elections in recent history they haven't really shifted the dial much. Voters' opinions of the parties are a function of things besides manifesto promises, with one key exception, and that's in 2017 with the Conservative manifesto when they released their social care policy, which became very quickly known as the dementia tax. We see that the Conservative lead over Labour fell from 17 points the week before that happened to just 8 points the week after. So a bad campaign really can make all the difference to the public's voting intention. Is there a threat to Labour from the left, Greens, Lib Dems, or Independents? Potentially, but what we've seen is tracking the most progressive segment of the population using More in Common's segmentation lens. We've actually seen some of these more progressive voters returning to Labour recently. There's been a slight uptick in the proportion who are intending to vote Labour, and that's really only just happened since the election was called. So perhaps there's something to this where people are kind of focusing minds and people are returning to Labour rather than sticking with the Greens or Lib Dems. Turning to Reform now. Reform voters overwhelmingly are formerly Conservative voters in 2019. But there's a lot of debate here about how much it would benefit the Conservatives if Reform stood down or if their vote share collapsed at the last minute. Perhaps a little bit, but really, if you look at the graph on the right here, only a small portion of current Reform voters would actually return to the Conservatives if Reform was not standing a candidate in their seat. Some would switch to Labour, but a large portion would just not vote at all. But I think the relationship between voting Reform, voting Conservative, does explain some of the campaign strategy we've seen from the Conservatives recently, focusing on Mickey Mouse degrees, national service, the pension, triple lock plus, trying to win over some of those Reform voters back to the Conservatives. And you can see how much of a difference that could make if it was successful. So we've modeled here if half of Reform voters switched back to the Conservatives, Conservatives would rise from about 180 seats they're predicted right now up to 230, quite a large jump there. And if all of Reform voters switch back, which is not a realistic scenario, but it illustrates how important these voters are to the Conservative coalition in the long run. The Conservative vote could go up to 270 seats, which would be take us back into hung parliament territory. So some insights from our recent focus group during the debate. There are so we spoke to voters in Milton Keynes, and this was a mix of people, mix of ages, mix of gender, some intending to vote Conservative, some leaning towards Labour, some undecided. So a real mix of people from a classic bellwether seat like Milton Keynes. And there were I think, a few key takeaways for us here. So some of the positives for Sunak, some of the things he might be happy with from what voters saw that night, was his take it or leave it attitude to some of the questions, that planting his flag clearly in the ground and saying, this is where I stand, this is my position. You may not like it, but this is what I believe in. This is what I would do if I was re-elected. That went across quite well with voters. They thought he answered clearly, gave clear answers. But on the other hand, voters clearly picked up on him talking over Starmer, talking over the moderator, and some thought that was a bit pushy, a bit arrogant, a bit aggressive, and came across as like a little bit slimy, to use some of the language you saw in that group. So a real mix for Sunak there, coming across as clear, but also a bit potentially arrogant or pushy. For Starmer, quite different. People clearly picked up on the fact that when he answered, he began most answers by acknowledging the kind of personal experience of the person asking the question. This came across as like empathetic and much more agreeable, which clearly resonates with voters. Voters want politicians to be in touch, relatable, and kind of understand the struggles they're facing, and Keir Starmer did that quite well. He communicated that very effectively in the debate. But on the other hand, they also want politicians to be clear and decisive, and that was where Starmer struggled a little bit. So people were picking up on the fact that he wasn't answering the questions or avoided the question altogether, wasn't giving enough detail, a bit fluffy, a bit woolly. And this is not at all going to help with public perception that they're not sure what Labour stand for, and or they're not sure what Keir Starmer really believes in. What would he do in government? And this is something that we saw Rishi Sunak hammer quite hard on in the debate as well. Like, we're not sure what we get with Labour. What are we going to get? What do you believe? And that is all reinforcing voters' perception of Labour. So Labour need to change that quite quickly. Otherwise, it will really set in that people don't know what they believe in, what they're going to do, and all that. So the sense of the unknown. But one of the lasting impressions, the kind of enduring impression from that debate, was just how unenthusiastic people were about the election after watching it. One of our participants, Paul, said that he's even less inclined to vote for either of them after watching that debate, like watching two children squabbling in the playground, talking over each other, just bickering, and not having a serious discussion about the issues facing people in the future of the country. That's all from me. I'm happy to open up to questions if there are any. I think there might be a Q&A function. See that. Yes, from Jen, does the seat projection take into account tactical voting? So we, in the model, we decided not to have an explicit tactical voting adjustment. Our view tends to be that if there is tactical voting, we'll pick that up in the headline voting intentions, people saying they're actually going to switch party, rather than trying to project it ourselves. And I think a lot of this is because, so some tactical voting will already have taken place. Some people will already have decided to tactically, if they prefer the Lib Dems, for instance, tactically say they're going to vote Labour. So we're already picking up some tactical voting in the headline voting intention. So no, we haven't got a specific overlay. I think that's probably the right way to go for this when modeling voting intention. From James, what will happen if to seats if Reform and Tories converge, and we get Reform 21, I assume 21%, Tories 19%. That's a huge unknown, because a lot of the data that goes into an MRP is based on the historical results. So from 2019 or 17, for instance. So the model is trained on history, so we're not entirely sure what it could look like if the Conservative Party and Reform Party converge on the same vote share, and that's so. It's a huge unknown. I mean, we could be looking at. My hunch is that it may not be, but we really could be looking at a kind of scenario that looks like Canada in 1993. And trying to model that at a seat level is very difficult right now. I think we really need to look or wait and see whether this holds up in the long term. Like how sustained is Reform polling at 20%? It's a huge unknown, and I think that's something that all pollsters will have to grapple with over the next few weeks. From Peter, has the tax figure dispute registered with anyone? So from our polling, we haven't picked that up yet. It's one of those things that could filter through to the public, and it was mentioned a lot during the debate. And I think the Conservative strategy is to hope that that number sticks. And to be fair, the more that that Labour tried to counter that figure, the more that people will hear it, and it's the hearing it that counts. With one potential exception, is that it depends which story lands. So is the story, oh, I've heard Labour is going to raise my taxes by £2,000, or is the story, oh, Rishi Sunak made a false claim on live TV? And whichever way we go will determine quite a lot about people's perception of the two main parties and the two main leaders. But I think it's still too early to tell on that one. From Catherine, which voters might respond positively to the? Oh, I think just answered that one. Yeah, it really depends. I mean, it could go either of two ways. Either people, either the kind of £2,000 tax rise sticks in voters' minds, or the perception is that Sunak said something misleading on TV. It really could depend. From anonymous attendee, to what extent do we feel that focus groups and polling are influencing the campaign by parties and leaders? That one's difficult to say. I mean, the campaigns do pay attention to the polls and focus groups, but it's very hard to find a causal link between things that are published from polls or focus group votes and actual changes in the campaign. It's very hard to find a causal link between those two, but I suspect it might do. From Richard, how possible is it that the Lib Dems end up with more seats than the Conservatives? I mean, so that has never happened before. I think it would have to be an absolutely disastrous night for the Conservatives to come third in terms of seats. There are some MRP projections that come close to that, with the Conservatives on about 70, Lib Dems on 60. But that would be historically unprecedented, and just the geography of the Lib Dem vote share, it's very concentrated in a few places, particularly in the West Country or in some of those commuter seats outside London. But the Lib Dems struggle to get more than double figures in most of the country. So for the Lib Dems to go from the last election was 11 seats they won, to get up to 50 or 60 is doable, but to get much beyond that is quite tricky, just because of the geography of where their support clusters. Is our projection for the SNP rather optimistic? Currently, it's a little bit higher than average, but to be honest, I think the main story from Scotland is just how close these seats are. And even with a very, very small shift, you get the SNP being almost wiped out in Scotland in one direction, but with a very small shift in the other way, you get them kind of recovering and holding on to most of their seats from 2019. So the thing with Scotland is just how close it all is. It's real on a knife edge. And the other difficult thing with modeling Scotland is because census data, it's a bit of a technical point, but and this is something that all pollsters are finding, is that the census data for Scotland hasn't been released yet. So it's very difficult to update the model with new data. So there's like a couple of challenges to modeling in Scotland. There's the dynamics of, well, 4 parties that win a decent number of seats in Scotland, plus the fact that data is still from 2011. And then you've got the marginality of most of those seats. From anonymous attendee, do we know to what extent the civic pragmatist and established liberal segments have shifted towards Labour? So the main story really is that, so from More in Common's 7 segments, most of those have shifted towards Labour. The really real interesting thing about Labour's increase in the vote share is just how uniform it is across demographics. They're winning everywhere. So out of the 7 segments that we track, depending on when you ask, about 5 or 6 are now leaning Labour, whereas at the last election it was about 3. So I mean, you see Labour picking up votes among homeowners, among older voters, among rural voters. They really are picking up support amongst a broad range of demographics. How does More in Common's MRP prediction compare to YouGov? I mean, in many ways, it's quite similar. And if you think about some of the projections we've seen from pollsters having the Conservatives down on 70, 80, 90 seats, there's a very broad range of estimates based on MRPs right now. And part of that is because there are so many undecided voters, and different pollsters model them in different ways. That's why you get some of the variety in estimates. More in Common's MRP broadly is what you'd expect, given our national headline voting intention. The way we do it tends to be a little bit more favourable to the Conservatives than some other pollsters. And that is reflected in the fact that our projected majority at the moment for Labour is also a bit lower than YouGov's. Do you think Labour will lose some seats over Gaza? It's not impossible, but it's highly unlikely. If you look at where the seats where Labour could lose some of their vote share to either Gaza Independence or the Greens, those tend to be in very, very safe Labour seats. So the Labour support among Muslim voters in these areas would have to collapse from about, it would have to halve essentially in order to risk making any difference to the number of seats that they hold. So it's unlikely, but it's obviously not impossible. There are some marginal seats where a small difference, a collapse in Labour Muslim vote could make a difference to the outcome. But given that they're 20 points ahead of the Conservatives right now, I don't think it's something that the party is particularly worried about in terms of winning a majority. I think those are all the questions so far. So unless any more trickle in over the next 30 seconds or so, I think I'll thank everyone for coming along today. And just a reminder that these are a weekly webinar series. So we'll have updates every week on how the campaign is going, the state of the two main parties, what are voters thinking are the main issues, is that changing or not? Every week for the remainder of the campaign. And you can find so many cool graphs and maps on our website, More in Common. So do head over and check that out. And I hope to see you all next week.